America is in decline. Sure, it has the strongest military in the world, it's one of the most economically and politically influential countries in the world, and it still has a lot of soft power remaining. But when we take a look at the truth of the American economy for the average citizen, we see a very different story. Let's dive into these 12 graphs that show what's wrong and consider what changed since the 1980s to get us to where we are today. Let's start by setting the baseline. America's GDP per capita, the measure of how much wealth the country has relative to its population size, has been steadily rising for more than 200 years now. No problem there. The country is getting wealthier and wealthier as the years go by. Great job, America. But if things are going so well for the country, why do so many people feel like they're struggling more than ever these days? Well, one explanation lies in the rise of globalization. Wealth is a relative measure of success. Even the poorest Americans today tend to live better lives than even some kings of long ago. So how does America's economy compare with the rest of the world? After World War II, America was the main superpower on Earth in terms of military, political, financial, and cultural power. The Cold War with the Soviet Union persisted, but back then America accounted for nearly half of all global wealth, with levels of prosperity unprecedented in human history. Even though the average American now has better medical care, technology, entertainment, etc. than the average person from the 1950s, back in the 50s people felt better about their situation because they saw that it was the best that humanity had ever achieved. Something most Americans today can't say about their own condition, looking at all the ways other countries are faring better in various respects. America has only 5% of the global population. So you can deduce that as the world becomes more equitable across various countries, America's relative wealth and power should decline to 15%. Starting from the 50% of the 1950s, that's quite a long way to fall. And America hasn't done it very gracefully. Even now in 2021, America's share of global wealth is still above 20%, while our share of population remains at only 5%. With only a few more percentage points to reasonably fall, and growing domestic struggles as we do so, it's time for everyone to take a look at how America got in this situation, and what can be done to slow the decline, and protect people from its dangerous impacts. With that, let's take a look at another graph, income inequality. The United States had insanely high levels of wealth inequality through the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression. Inequality that wasn't resolved until the total societal investment in World War II. Since then, in the post-war period and throughout the Cold War, America was a surprisingly equitable society, at least in terms of financial wealth on a large scale. This is the period that many older people now remember as the golden age of America, despite its many social flaws at the time. But then in the 1980s, something happened to send the country skyrocketing back to Roaring Twenties levels of inequality. There's still no definitive answer on why that is, but some of the most serious contenders include the end of the Cold War, increasing globalization, the technological revolution, increased corporate influence on the federal government, and President Ronald Reagan's failed trickle-down economics policies. Speaking of which, let's take a look at how the income of Americans has changed over time. While income has continuously increased for the top 95th percentile of American citizens, income has remained relatively stagnant and not kept up with inflation for the majority of Americans. And based on recent developments, this trend is only accelerating into the future. But how did we get to a place where the top 5% of the public has so much more income growth than the bottom 95%? You could argue for any of the factors previously mentioned, but one undeniable factor in this was Ronald Reagan's tax cuts for the ultra-wealthy. Taxes on the ultra-wealthy in America have been decreasing steadily since the end of World War II, but they were greatly accelerated by trickle-down economic policy in the 1980s. You can see a sharp drop-off in the graph of this trend, and at the same time you can notice the subtle rise in taxes on the average worker. As you might expect, this is a huge contributing factor to America's wealth inequality today, and declining quality of life overall. Meanwhile, as taxes fall for the rich and rise for the poor, here's a more detailed look at the income stagnation mentioned earlier. The higher blue line shows total productivity of the average American worker, which has been increasing steadily due to longer hours, more education, better efficiency, and incredible technological innovations. But at the same time, we see that lower black line, showing the wages paid to these same average American employees. Companies are more productive and wealthy than ever, but that profit is no longer returned to the workers. Rather, it's all pocketed into the stock market and savings accounts of CEOs, upper managers, and other business leaders controlling the companies. Also, the workers have no alternative option as they're required to work long hours for low pay with little chance of a raise or promotion, all just so they can continue trying to survive. Most living from paycheck to paycheck in poor conditions compared to the previous generations. Then, as these factors squeeze the pockets of the average American, those on the lowest rungs of the economic ladder have been hit even harder. As the general wage stagnation affects most Americans, those working part-time, low-demand, and low-skill jobs face an even greater struggle in terms of wage theft. Despite these workers also making great strides in productivity, along with the rest of the country, minimum wage has stayed absolutely stuck. If it had kept up with inflation, with no actual increases, the federal minimum wage today would be almost $25 per hour. But the real minimum wage is only a pathetic $7.25 per hour. And of course, as you can probably guess, all of these huge economic downturns for the average person in the United States have had a huge impact on society, and not in a positive way. One to consider is the cost of housing. Housing prices in America have risen dramatically, far above the actual income of most Americans. Prior to the 1970s, housing and rent costs were low enough that regular families working regular jobs could be confident that they would be able to save their money and achieve the American dream. But since then, to most young adults these days, paying for rent is a serious struggle, even with a full-time job. And buying a house is such an unrealistic dream that most can only laugh when they hear the idea. But it's not just housing costs that have become out of reach for most. Most young adults these days are also saddled with crippling amounts of student debt. And of course, this trend also began in the 1980s, like everything else. You might be asking why people would still continue going to college then if the tuition had raised to such insane rates that will incur a lifelong debt. Well, the thing is that with degree inflation and the current fragile economy for most Americans, a college degree is necessary to even have a decent chance at employment. The unemployment rate for those with only a high school education or a GED is significantly higher, enough that it becomes necessary for people to take on the crippling college debt mentioned earlier. This leaves the country in a spot where most young people either can't get a job, can't pay off their immense loans, or worse, both at the same time. And see that giant unemployment spike in 2020 for everyone all at once? The one far worse than the Great Recession? Yeah, that was the pandemic, and it still hasn't fully been recovered as of the release of this video. So with all these new struggles introduced since the 1980s, what troubling societal impacts does this have? Sure, the economy has a lot of problems, and the average person is in a far worse situation now than previous generations were, but is it really a societal decline? Well, one way to see the effects of this is on the average age of marriage among young adults. Again, right in the 1980s, we see a giant dramatic change. In the past, when the American dream was still alive and well for most, young people tended to graduate from high school or college, get a decent job, get married, start a family, start their life, and begin building their wealth. But these days, young people are forced to go through more and more years of college, hoping their various degrees can get them a decent job above the minimum wage. Marrying late without the financial stability needed to raise a family, with no home of their own, and very little hope. Societal decline in action. But if family building and stability aren't your thing, here's another important marker of the societal decline. Leading up to and in the 1980s, America was in line with the rest of the developed world in terms of life expectancy. But since then, with all the various changes mentioned earlier, the average life expectancy of Americans has improved at a slower and slower rate up until the year 2020, when life expectancy in America actually decreased for the first time since the 1940s. Things really aren't going great, and this decline doesn't appear to be slowing down anytime soon. But despite the danger of these struggles facing the country, remember that there's still hope, and there's still time to turn things around if the American people advocate for solutions to the problems. Thanks for watching the video. Leave a comment with your thoughts or personal experience, and check out these other videos from my channel to learn more about how the United States can improve its outlook going forward. I hope you learned something new, and I'll see you next time.